Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're undertaking, really, a forensic dissection of a moment in geopolitical history that was executed with surgical speed and, honestly, apocalyptic force. We are plunging into the details of Operation Absolute Resolve, the unilateral extraction of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro, and the subsequent brutal dismantling of a state that was built on organized crime.
It's so essential to frame this correctly for you, the listener.
Yeah.
The sources we've synthesized, they don't treat this event as a diplomatic crisis or, a simple military intervention.
No, not at all.
They treat the entire Venezuelan apparatus as a sophisticated transnational criminal network that was, for all intents and purposes, decapitated.
Right.
What occurred in those 148 minutes on January 3rd, 2026 was arguably the most significant and certainly the most aggressive projection of American hard power in the Western Hemisphere since the end of the Cold War.
And that's our mission today, to move past the superficial headlines and really understand the facts of what happened here. We have to analyze the operational mechanics, the sheer kinetic audacity of the raid, and then we have to descend into the subterranean criminal heart it exposed.
And that's a dark place.
A very dark place. We're going to cover the visceral human rights infrastructure, the state terror that was left behind, and finally, we have to confront the profoundly cynical political compromise that followed, which frankly risks setting a terrible and dangerous global precedent.
We're here to understand the brutal facts and the very difficult moral implications that come after.
Okay, let's dig in. Let's unpack the groundwork for this whole operation.
To really appreciate the precision of Operation Absolute Resolve, you first have to recognize that this wasn't some spontaneous decision.
Right, this wasn't a snap judgment.
Not at all. It was the kinetic culmination of a meticulous, months-long, layered campaign that the U.S. military dubbed Operation Southern Spear. It was all that long-game preparation that made the final strike even possible.
And what truly defines this entire campaign, I think, is the painstaking effort the U.S. took to construct a legally defensible pretext for it all.
Yes.
They didn't declare war. They declared a police action against terrorist entities. The very first element, Phase I, was designation. Starting in late 2025, the U.S. government, specifically the Treasury and State Departments, systematically designated key elements of the Venezuelan apparatus. We're talking about the Cartel of the Suns and the hyper-violent gang Tren de Aragua as foreign terrorist organizations, FTOs.
And that designation, it was the crucial legal maneuver. It wasn't just bureaucracy. It was the entire foundation for everything that followed.
It changes the rules of engagement completely.
It does. By labeling these entities as FTOs, the U.S. legally reframed any military action. They weren't invading a sovereign nation to effect regime change, a move that would trigger, global condemnation.
Of course.
They were engaging in an armed conflict against non-state terrorist actors linked to international criminal conspiracies. It swapped a political crisis for a counterterrorism operation, and that offered massive legal protection for the operators on the ground. So once that legal cover was established, the escalation became very deliberate and systematic. Phase 2 was interdiction and degradation.
Yes, and this phase was characterized by tactical violence directed squarely at the criminal revenue streams that the regime depended on to survive.
So they're hitting them where it hurts. The money.
The money, exactly. We are talking about over 35 distinct kinetic strikes on maritime vessels. These were boats linked directly to drug running by the Tren de Aragua and the ELN, the National Liberation Army of Colombia, which was deeply embedded in Venezuelan territory.
And the body count from just that phase.
The estimated body count from this phase alone exceeded 115 fatalities.
Oh, wow.
And this achieved multiple strategic goals. Firstly, it choked the regime's illicit revenue streams. But critically, it also served as a real-time, high-stakes test of the Venezuelan radar and maritime response times.
So they were probing.
They were probing the defenses, gathering intelligence on exactly how fast and how effectively Venezuela could react to repeated high-intensity incursions. They were taking the pulse of the opposition before the main event.
And then comes the economic chokehold. Phase 3, isolation and strangulation.
This was the naval blockade. Most famously, it involved oil tankers like the Bella 1. The U.S. actions forced Caracas into relying entirely on its vulnerable, poorly maintained shadow fleet for any oil exports.
So this phase wasn't about kinetic violence.
No, not at all. This was about economic paralysis, tightening the financial screws to the point where internal dissent within the military or the government became, plausible, weakening the system from the inside out.
But the truly game-changing preparation was phase or blindness. This is where the technological asymmetry became just overwhelming.
It's the silent war.
Hmm.
This phase involved an intensive campaign of cyber attacks and sophisticated electronic warfare.
And what was the specific goal there?
The specific goal was not to degrade power or communications generally, but to surgically blind the Venezuelan air defense grid.
The S-300s.
Exactly. Venezuela's strategic defense relies heavily on Russian S-300 surface-to-air missile systems. The cyber and electronic attacks were designed to render those systems completely useless, to prevent them from locking onto targets.
You can't shoot down what you can't see.
You simply cannot. This created the necessary critical window for U.S. stealth infiltration assets, specifically the RQ-170 Sentinel drones, to penetrate Venezuelan airspace completely undetected and begin real-time surveillance for the final strike.
Okay, so that meticulous, calculated groundwork is why the actual raid could be so fast and so decisive. And this is where it gets really interesting the moment the world woke up to the news. The midnight extraction. We know the authorization came directly from President Trump at 22.46 Eastern Standard Time on January 2, 2026.
Right. And the intelligence had confirmed the location, which was a dynamic, constantly shifting target. Maduro was rotating nightly among 6 to 8 highly fortified safe houses, all within military complexes.
A hard target to pin down.
Very. The tactical plan was predicated on absolute surprise and just overwhelming force. At 02.01 Venezuelan time VET, we should clarify, the coordinated suppression began.
And how did that play out?
Precision munitions simultaneously struck critical targets. The Fuerte Tiuna military complex, and perhaps more importantly, the runway and hangars at La Carlota Air Base.
And people on the ground.
The noise, as the sources detail, was mistaken by many residents in the nearby 23 de Enero barrio for major fireworks.
Wow.
That was the sound of the S-300 systems being suppressed and the Venezuelan Air Force being grounded before it could spool up a single jet.
And while the air defenses were being suppressed, the ground element was executing the main assault. Talk us through the force composition, because this was, a high-level kinetic application.
Here's the tip of the spear. The primary assault force consisted of approximately 200 operators drawn from the legendary Delta Force, supported by the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers.
The best of the best.
And what made this raid technologically unique was the sheer advantage they leveraged. This was the first operational use of U.S. stealth helicopters in this specific theater, combined with one-way attack drone swarming technology.
Right.
This allowed a very small force to create a massive synchronized local advantage in firepower and surveillance, overwhelming fixed positions instantaneously.
Swarming technology, for the listener who might not be familiar, that means coordinating dozens of small, cheap, autonomous drones to attack a target all at once, right? To saturate its defenses.
That's it. It's a total game changer in modern warfare.
Absolutely.
And the physical assault on the fortress where Maduro was hiding, described as a hardened military bunker, was pure, focused, tactical violence.
How did they get in?
The sources state that the operators utilized military-grade explosive charges and sophisticated thermal torches to breach multiple layers of reinforced steel doors.
And they knew how to do it.
They knew exactly how.
Yeah.
Crucially, the sources confirm that this exact assault sequence had been rehearsed repeatedly on a full-scale mock-up of the safe house, built secretly back in the U.S.
So they'd run the mission dozens of times before they even left.
They knew exactly how many charges and where before they even stepped off the aircraft. That level of meticulous planning is just chilling.
It really is. And the final moments of the capture itself.
Chaotic, but incredibly fast. Maduro and Celia Flores, his wife, were intercepted just moments before they could reach a dedicated panic room.
Really? That close?
That close. They were bum-rushed in the language of the operators, and they were found in their sleepwear.
Unbelievable.
They were immediately secured, transferred by stealth helicopter to the waiting USS Iwo Jima out in the Caribbean, and from there, flown directly to New York to face federal charges. It was, from a tactical perspective, a flawless extraction.
But, as with all military action, there was a blood price. And this is the detail that truly escalated the long-term stakes. The Cuban blood debt.
This is absolutely critical. The smooth tactical execution came at a heavy human cost, and that cost was primarily borne by an unanticipated force.
It wasn't the Venezuelan military.
No. The sources describe the resistance as very violent, not because it demoralized Venezuelan conscripts, but because of a hardened cadre of Cuban security and intelligence personnel.
So Havana's people were his last line of defense.
Deeply integrated. Havana had its most loyal, battle-ready operatives built into Maduro's personal protection and survival mechanism.
And the specific tally is horrifying in its regional significance.
32 Cuban military and intelligence personnel were confirmed killed in direct combat with U.S. operators.
32.
32. This is not some minor skirmish. This is the deadliest direct engagement between U.S. and Cuban military assets in decades. It's an inflection point in history.
Did Havana acknowledge it?
They did. Havana acknowledged the casualties, stating the personnel were carrying out missions for the Venezuelan government, which just confirms the depth of their entanglement.
And what about Venezuelan casualties?
Beyond the Cuban deaths, 23 to 24 Venezuelan military members were also killed. And on the U.S. side, 7 were injured. 2 confirmed civilian collateral deaths as well.
But the focus remains on the Cubans.
Yes, because that bloodletting fundamentally complicates any future regional diplomacy. Any attempt at normalization or stabilization now carries the weight of 32 Cuban deaths at the hands of U.S. forces. It guarantees profound and likely irreparable hostility in the immediate future.
So this wasn't just a political regime change.
No, it was a hot military confrontation that revealed a deep, hostile integration between states that many had suspected, but few had seen in action. It sets a staggering new benchmark for risk in the hemisphere.
Okay, so the military action was given its mandate by this legal fiction, that Venezuela was not a government, but a high-level criminal operation.
Right.
That takes us into part 2, and this is where it gets really sickening. We have to look at the evidence contained in the unsealed indictments that recast the entire Venezuelan executive branch as a sophisticated mafia.
And that mafia is known as the Cartel of the Suns, or Cartel de los Soles.
The name itself is a tell.
We must stress that the name is key. The Suns refers directly to the sun-shaped insignia worn by Venezuelan generals. This organization is not some external shadowy entity. It is a horizontal patronage network operating throughout the absolute highest echelons of the Venezuelan military and the executive branch.
It is a state.
It is state-sponsored crime, where your military rank equals your criminal capability. The system of military command became the structure for criminal distribution.
And the sources allege that since the late 1990s, the regime deliberately employed cocaine trafficking as a weapon, as a tool, intending to inflict societal costs on the U.S.
Yes, a strategic methodology explicitly categorizes narco-terrorism in the indictment.
The scale of it is just immense.
It is. We are talking about systematic, multi-ton cocaine shipments utilizing state-owned infrastructure. They didn't use private boats. They used state naval vessels.
Unbelievable.
They didn't use hidden airstrips. They used Maiquetía International Airport. The entire Venezuelan state logistics system was repurposed for drug running.
And the indictment also details a connection to FARC.
A staggering 25-year conspiracy with FARC, the now mostly disbanded Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. Venezuela provided weapons and state protection to FARC in exchange for safe passage of the drug shipments through Colombian and Venezuelan territory.
It was a decades-long alliance.
A 2-decade alliance between a designated terrorist group and a sovereign government.
And the rot went right into the president's bedroom. Cilia Flores, the First Lady, often called the first combatant, she's explicitly charged with abusing her position of power.
She allegedly accepted substantial bribes, specifically to broker critical meetings between major drug traffickers and the National Anti-Drug Office.
So she was the gatekeeper.
She was the gatekeeper. She wasn't just turning a blind eye. She was actively monetizing the state's security and anti-narcotics apparatus. She was selling state protection to organized crime, acting as an essential broker for the Cartel of the Suns, using her position as the ultimate protection racket.
So while the Cartel of the Suns managed the macro logistics and the military protection, the sheer volume of brutal street-level criminal enforcement and violence was outsourced.
Outsourced to transnational mega-gangs like Tren de Aragua.
And this group originated from inside a prison.
Yes, which is chilling. From inside the Tocaron prison system, it has expanded terrifyingly fast. It has metastasized throughout South America, establishing operational cells in Chile, Peru, Colombia, and it's even been identified in the U.S. as well.
And what they export is a specific kind of violence.
It's a methodology of hyperviolence that sets them apart. This is where the sources force us to acknowledge a truly visceral level of depravity. As we said, this is 18+ content because the specific methods employed by Tren de Aragua are designed for maximum terror and psychological trauma.
It's violence as a brand.
It's violence as a branding strategy to eliminate rivals and absolutely paralyze local populations into submission. One such tactic, detailed in the forensic reports, is the cement tomb.
Just the name is horrific.
Victims, often people who refused extortion or posed some internal threat, have been discovered buried alive in cement, or placed in suitcases and buried in shallow desert graves.
My God.
This is not simple murder. It's a calculated, agonizing way to impose pure terror, ensuring a slow, horrific end designed to send a chilling message to anyone else who might think of crossing them.
And their signature of overkill is also intentional.
Very. Forensic reports frequently describe bodies recovered with 15 to 20 gunshot wounds, indicating total, absolute dominance.
They're emulating other cartels too, right?
Yes, we see them explicitly emulating the tactics of Mexico's most brutal cartels, specifically Los Zetas. They're utilizing beheadings and the public hanging of corpses from bridges to mark their newly acquired territory and just maximize shock value across borders.
But perhaps the deepest, most systemic horror is their exploitation of the humanitarian disaster in Venezuela.
That's where it gets even darker. They are deeply involved in sexual slavery, systematically trafficking Venezuelan migrant women who have fled the crisis.
These are desperate people.
The most desperate.
Yeah.
These women are forced into prostitution rings across the entire continent. And this is maintained through sophisticated debt bondage, manipulating their economic desperation, and, worst of all,
What?
using explicit threats of torture and violence against their families who remain back in Venezuela if the victims even think about trying to escape.
That is the ultimate coercive power, turning the state's failure into a global, industrialized human trafficking mechanism.
Exactly. And what truly indicts the government is the alleged connection. The indictment alleges that Maduro's inner circle didn't just tolerate this.
They were in on it.
They provided the crucial law enforcement cover for these operations in exchange for a significant cut of the profits.
So the state was protecting them.
The supposed government was actively protecting a transnational gang responsible for burying people alive and running sophisticated sexual slavery rings throughout the continent. It forces us to conclude that the Venezuelan state wasn't just failing, it was the principal and most ruthless shareholder in a global criminal enterprise based on human suffering.
We have to move now from the transactional crime to the infrastructure of political repression, because Maduro may be gone, but the atmosphere of fear he cultivated persists.
It persists because the institutions he built remain entirely intact. The source material takes us into the heart of this fear, El Helicoide and the DGCIM.
Let's start with El Helicoide, because the history of that building is so perverse. It was built in the 1950s as a symbol of optimism and staggering oil wealth.
A utopian vision.
A futuristic, utopian vision of a drive-through shopping mall designed with these beautiful ascending ramps.
The irony is just brutal. That symbol of modernity is now a dystopian panopticon utilized by SEBIN, the Bolivarian National Intelligence Service, as the primary holding and torture facility for political prisoners.
The spiral ramp that once promised easy access to luxury now defines the descent into hell.
Precisely. And the accounts emerging from survivors describe not just abuse, but industrial scale, institutionalized torture. This is not arbitrary violence. These are calculated techniques designed to annihilate identity and extract compliance.
The physical and psychological destruction is part of the system.
It is the system. It's designed not merely to extract information, but to ensure that the individual, if they ever leave, is permanently broken. Let's detail some of the specific techniques documented by human rights groups. One standard interrogation technique is the plastic bag.
That sounds simple, but the use is anything but.
It's pure physiological terror. A plastic bag is tightly placed over the detainee's head and held there until they reach the point of syncope fainting due to oxygen deprivation.
And then they stop.
They release it, allowing them a terrifying gas of air, only to be immediately repeated. This cycle of near-death asphyxiation torture is employed routinely to induce extreme physiological shock without necessarily leaving overt, immediately lethal marks.
It's an office tool for inflicting maximum terror.
That's a good way to put it. And beyond the physical shock, the sensory torture detailed in the sources sounds designed to destroy the very perception of reality.
Yes, that's the intent. Prisoners are housed in infamous cells referred to as the aquarium or the little tiger. These are chambers of absolute degradation.
What happens in the aquarium?
Detainees are subjected to constant, artificial, blinding light 24 hours a day, destroying any sense of time or circadian rhythm. Others are held in absolute total darkness, covered in human feces, and infested with cockroaches and rats.
The environment itself becomes the weapon.
An active weapon used to break the detainee's will and sanity. And then there is the calculated physical violence that aims to inflict maximum pain while maintaining deniability. The systemic use of electric shock is a core component.
Where is it applied?
To the most sensitive areas, the genitals, the tongue, the nipples. It induces extreme, debilitating neuromuscular incapacitation. But the clinical cruelty here is that it's applied specifically to avoid leaving obvious, lethal external signs that might be easily cataloged by international forensic observers.
Designed for maximum pain, maximum deniability.
Exactly. But perhaps the most insidious, the most disgusting tool of coercion detailed in the sources is the systemic use of sexual violence.
It's employed institutionally. Female detainees face sexual assault and rape as a routine part of their confinement. But shockingly, even male opposition figures are subjected to sexual abuse and the horrific ongoing threat of rape against their family members.
They use the families as leverage.
Explicitly. Threats targeting their wives, daughters, or mothers are used as the primary lever to break down resistance, extract false confessions, and guarantee cooperation. Family members are rendered invisible, emotional hostages in the system.
The psychological terror is relentless, and it culminates in techniques designed to break the mind permanently, like the frequent mock executions.
The sources recount frequent stages of psychological breaking. Guards will sometimes place an unloaded weapon directly in a detainee's mouth and pull the trigger.
Oh my God.
Or they will stage the execution of other prisoners, using blanks or actors, just within earshot. This induces profound trauma and guarantees that the detainee genuinely believes every breath they take is their absolute last. It's designed to shatter the very core of their psychological resilience.
And El Helicoid, run by Sebin, is only one side of the coin. The sources also highlight the DGCIM, the Directorate General of Military Counterintelligence.
And their focus is on military officers suspected of disloyalty.
Right. And the DGCIM operates with even less scrutiny, and its brutality aims explicitly for permanent damage. They are documented beating detainees until they suffer permanent hearing loss or irreparable organ damage.
It's not just pain, it's about maiming.
Yes. One particularly sadistic technique documented involved cutting the soles of the detainees' feet with razor blades. Not for immediate fatal injury, but to make standing or walking excruciatingly painful for months or years afterward.
Eliminating any hope of escape or even basic human function.
And of course, the classic stress positions.
The notorious stipple. The detainee is handcuffed in an unnatural position, often to a chair or a bar, for days on end. This inevitably leads to severe edema, circulation cutoff, and permanent nerve damage.
This entire architecture of Fear 7, DGCM, and all the tactics they deploy is the true living legacy of Maduro.
Which brings us to the core moral dilemma of transition. The kinetic operation was a success. The target is gone, but the apparatus remains.
And the prisoners.
Over 1,600 political prisoners are still inside these dungeons. The sources state bluntly, these prisoners are effectively serving as hostages for the new regime's stability.
So any new government that attempts radical immediate reform risks what?
They risk triggering a backlash that could see these remaining prisoners become instant collateral. The U.S. cut off the head, but the body of the beast remains coiled and ready to strike.
So given the massive political and military risk taken in Operation Absolute Resolve, the world, and certainly the Venezuelan democratic opposition, expected a clear outcome.
The installation of the legitimate election winner, Edmundo Gonzalez, or perhaps the powerful, charismatic hardline conservative, Maria Corina Machado.
That was the political expectation, the democratic promise. The reality, however, was a shocking, cynical pivot. The Delcy deal.
Within 48 hours of Maduro being flown out, Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, a deeply entrenched Chavista and an architect of the previous regime's policies, was sworn in as interim president.
How was that even possible?
It was achieved through a snap Supreme Court ruling to maintain what was termed administrative continuity.
And publicly, she condemned the raid.
Publicly, she condemned it as an illegal act of aggression, but private intelligence communications confirmed she was willing to comply with key U.S. strategic and economic demands.
This was a stunning betrayal of democratic principles. We have to analyze the strategic rationale. Why stability over democracy? Why accept an architect of the corruption they just dismantled?
The assessment by U.S. intelligence was brutally pragmatic. They concluded that installing the hardline democratic opposition immediately, figures like Machado, would trigger an outright civil war.
They thought the military would revolt.
The armed forces, the FANB, were still intact and loyal to the Chavista structure. Rodriguez, as a deep-seated bureaucrat, offered a clear path. Decapitate the crime boss, but keep the operational body of the state functioning.
To prevent total collapse.
To prevent total collapse, mass looting, and a civil war that would necessitate a full, bloody U.S. occupation. It was a calculus of minimizing regional chaos.
So the U.S. traded long-term democratic aspirations for immediate administrative convenience, and the core driver behind that convenience was the oil imperative.
Absolutely. Rodriguez is a former oil minister. She is known as a pragmatic, if corrupt, technocrat. She is viewed as the fastest and most effective way to achieve the U.S.'s primary economic goal, facilitating the rapid re-entry of Western oil majors, Chevron, Exxon, and so on, and crucially, dismantling the massive, complicated network of Russian and Chinese entanglement in PDVSA, the state oil company.
She's the key required to quickly stabilize global energy markets, regardless of her history.
That's the bet. And if the goal was stability, then the most dangerous remaining figure had to be neutralized. This leads to the strategy of containment.
Dios Cabello.
That's the one. The regime's radical security enforcer, who still commands the SEBIN and the colectivos, the armed militias. Rodriguez's installation acts as a wedge, isolating Cabello.
So they're trying to sideline him.
Intelligence reports confirm he has been put on notice, meaning he must cooperate with the new interim administration, or he will face the same fate as Maduro. The threat is explicit. The capability used to extract Maduro can be redeployed against him.
Let me push back on this, because this is where the cynicism feels absolute. The U.S. essentially installed a figure who was complicit in the criminal enterprise they used as justification for the invasion. Isn't that just replacing one architect of criminality with another?
It is the height of strategic cynicism, yes. The source is making clear that the goal shifted rapidly from liberation to resource acquisition and regional containment.
They chose stability, not justice.
They did. And that choice required the explicit marginalization of Machado, the Democratic hope.
President Trump's dismissal of Maria Corina Machado was astonishingly blunt.
He said she doesn't have the respect among the Chavista military elements required to lead.
That single statement publicly validated the cynical deal with Rodriguez and instantly fractured the anti-Maduro coalition.
And the consequence is immediate instability. Machado has rejected this U.S.-backed administration entirely. She views it as a profound betrayal of the Venezuelan people who voted for democratic change.
So she's not backing down.
She has vowed to return to Venezuela, setting up an internal conflict between the U.S.-backed pragmatists and the popular, democratically legitimate opposition. The move was tactically brilliant for stabilization, but morally bankrupt, trading democratic legitimacy for guaranteed oil access.
The moment the U.S. signaled its intent to control the oil flows via the Delcy deal, the law enforcement pretext it evaporated. And what took its place was an aggressive, modern interpretation of hemispheric control. The post-raid rhetoric immediately ushered in the Donroe Doctrine, a new, brazen assertion of a U.S. right to manage the Western Hemisphere's resources.
This doctrine represents a massive strategic shift. The U.S. signaled an explicit unilateral right to manage or essentially control the cash flows and resources of the region to repay the cost of reconstruction and stabilization.
It's a hostile takeover strategy.
Masked by stabilization rhetoric. The sheer nerve of asserting this right unilaterally is why this operation had global repercussions far beyond Caracas.
And the strategic prize is immense, driving the urgency. This is all about the economics of occupation. Venezuela holds a staggering 303 billion barrels of proven oil reserves.
The largest supply on the planet.
And the goal is to rapidly reintegrate this supply into the global market under U.S. supervision.
The U.S. strategy assumes that U.S. oil majors like Chevron and ConocoPhillips will now be running the industry. But this is where the financial reality hits the strategic ambition.
The infrastructure is a wreck.
Decades of sanctions, gross mismanagement, and neglect by the Chavista regime have utterly decimated the infrastructure. The analysts' estimates are chilling. Over $100 billion is needed just to repair the industry's dilapidated infrastructure, rebuild extraction capabilities, and ensure safe operations.
$100 billion is not a clean profit. It is a catastrophic liability they are inheriting.
Exactly. And that financial reality means the strategic bounce back won't be immediate. Analysts predict it will take at least 3 years before production output can reliably bounce back to a level that significantly impacts global energy prices and justifies that liability.
They're inheriting a massively valuable yet massively degraded asset.
Precisely. And while the U.S. was attempting to assert this new doctrine on the economic front, it created a massive, immediate, kinetic risk involving a major global rival, the Russian naval confrontation.
This began with the U.S. enforcing its naval blockade against the shadow fleet tankers exporting crude to China and Cuba.
Right. And the centerpiece of this conflict was the tanker Bella 1, later renamed Marinera. After evading the U.S. Coast Guard in the Caribbean, it fled toward the North Atlantic.
And this is where it gets complicated.
Crucially, mid-voyage, Russia successfully reflagged the vessel as Russian-owned. This instantly transformed a standard maritime interdiction of a criminal vessel into a direct, high-stakes, great power confrontation.
And Moscow's response was immediate and calculated.
They deployed a Kilo-class submarine and a naval surface group to escort the vessel, daring the U.S. to intervene against a sovereign military escort. This was a textbook game of maritime chicken, fought over a floating cargo of crude oil in the vast expanse of the Atlantic.
And the U.S. didn't back down.
The U.S. response was stunning in its resolve. U.S. naval forces, despite the physical presence of the Russian escort, boarded and seized the vessel.
How did Moscow react?
Predictably, they immediately labeled the action as piracy. This incident is perhaps the clearest indication that Washington is willing to enforce its newly asserted claim over these resources and its blockade, even at the palpable risk of a direct great power conflict at sea.
They risked a shooting war with Russia to secure that cargo.
They did.
So the kinetic triumph is finished, the political maneuver is complete, but the chaos is only just beginning. In the short term, the transition has immediately triggered widespread urban unrest.
We're seeing rapid mobilization of the colectivos, the regime's armed civilian militias. These groups are fiercely loyal to figures like Cabello and are concentrated in strongholds like the 23-day Nuevo Barrio in Caracas.
So they're taken to the streets.
They have established armed checkpoints and are running massive intimidation campaigns to suppress any attempt by the legitimate opposition to organize or celebrate. The fear of civil war and mass street violence is palpable, and it's paralyzing the population.
And the diplomatic fallout across the continent is equally dire. Regional rupture is immediate and severe.
Yes. Colombia's leftist president, Gustavo Petro, has publicly threatened to take up arms if the U.S. targets his country next. Brazil's President Lula condemned the operation as crossing an unacceptable line of sovereignty.
The U.S. has torched its relationships in the region.
Through this unilateral action, they have effectively shredded their diplomatic capital across South America, sacrificing regional stability for short-term strategic gain.
And this leads us to the long-term existential perils, which unfortunately draw extremely uncomfortable parallels to the instability that followed the 2003 invasion of Iraq.
The first major risk is insurgency. The Delcy deal has alienated the democratic opposition while failing to satisfy the hardline Chavistas.
So no one is happy.
No one. If the U.S.-backed government attempts to purge key military leaders like Cabello or Defense Minister Padrino, those individuals could take their armed factions, their loyalists within the FANB and the colectivos underground.
And an underground insurgency in Venezuela would target the only thing that matters.
The oil infrastructure.
Exactly.
They would launch a campaign of sabotage against the critical oil installations and export terminals, creating chronic instability and further delaying the much-anticipated rebound of oil production, ensuring the U.S. pays a continuous blood and financial price for its acquisition.
And the second long-term structural problem is systemic rot. By prioritizing stability and keeping the core Chavista bureaucracy, the architects of the criminal state in place via the Delcy deal,
you risk perpetuating the exact systemic corruption you claim to be curing.
The Cartel of the Suns isn't just one person.
It's not just Maduro. It is a network of thousands of military officials. Decapitation does not cure a generalized institutional cancer.
But the most dangerous consequence, the one that will haunt international relations for decades, is the global precedent.
Yes. Chinese analysts and state media immediately seized upon the operation. The comparison is direct and alarming.
What's the comparison they're making?
If the U.S. can unilaterally kidnap a sovereign leader to enforce the law under the guise of counter-narcotics, Beijing may feel profoundly and dangerously emboldened to use similar tactical violence against Taiwan's leadership.
Under the guise of what?
Potentially under the guise of internal policing or anti-separatism. The U.S. just handed its great power rivals the ultimate legal and tactical justification for future military aggression.
Operation Absolute Resolve was, tactically, an almost impossibly flawless demonstration of special operations dominance. But as the seized Marinera is towed into a U.S. port, guaranteeing that confrontation with Russia, and as the colectivos set up their armed checkpoints in the barrios of Caracas,
we are forced to confront the fundamental, harrowing question that the source material drives home.
And that question is whether tactical success can ever justify strategic cynicism when the price is the betrayal of democracy and the creation of a dangerous global precedent.
The transition from audaciously kinetic to agonizingly political has already begun, and we must watch to see if the immediate security of oil access outweighs the long-term cost of institutional decay and fractured democratic hope. This is a shadow that will extend far, far beyond.
Indeed. Something profound for you to chew on as the geopolitical map continues to shift. Thanks for diving duck with us.